Greetings, my name is Nina, welcome back to my channel. So we are here today for another tier list. I actually wanted to postpone making this video because I wanted to read more books for this video. However, I counted and there are basically more than 70 books here. So in this video I'm going to rank all the fantasy books that I have read so far. At least the ones that I remember reading. And of course, there are books that I really want to read, and in the future I would love to make another tier list with them. But for now, let's go along with these books. Let's do this. Okay, so here's the tier list. Fun fact about this video, this is a reshoot. I missed 2 series. I will mention this series later, and I decided to remake this video. I deleted all the footage and started anew. So in this video, unlike with my previous videos, I decided to rank the separate installments of the series. Usually, the first book represents the entire series. Well, in my previous videos that was the case. However, in this video I'm going to rank all the books separately. Okay, on the top we have absolute top tier, the books that I absolutely love. These books were written very well. They're very well done. The awesome tier is close enough. Then we have This Is Good, well, quite solid books. They're quite fun. Next we have It Could Have Been Better, the books that are quite good, but they lack something, and something could have been done really well. But definitely something holds them back. Next comes the sad tier, in my opinion, because I do not remember these books. Need to read them again. Next comes the meh. Okay, the books in this tier may not have been mediocre, but for me, they kinda were. They did not do much for me. Finally, we have the throw it to the hellfire tier. It means that the book sucked. Fact about me, recently I have fallen down the Lorna Shore rabbit hole, and the last tier, to throw it to the hellfire, is actually a reference to their song To the Hellfire. I did not expect to like Lorna Shore. I really want to talk about them in a separate video, but I thought that To the Hellfire is a solid title, and yeah, I know, solid song, and I named the worst tier here, Throw It to the Hellfire. It's just that I really hated these books. I am now really into Lorna Shore, and okay, never mind. Let's do this. Okay, we're going to start with The Hobbit, the oldest book here, and it's an absolute top tier. So I bought an English version of The Hobbit in Italy in March, and I'm going to read this book this summer. I really want to make a vlog. Okay, next we have Coraline by Neil Gaiman, quite a solid story, but unfortunately I really do not remember much. Okay, granted, I do remember a lot about the books from the I do not remember tier. However, I do really need to read them again because they're slowly fading into my memory. I also do need to mention fact about the meh tier. It's going to feature books that I do not remember, and I'm also not planning to read again. Coraline, I definitely would love to read again. I also really liked the Like a Film. I even rewatched it in its original language. Yes, for those of you who don't know, English is not my first language. I think it's quite noticeable. Okay, next we have The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub, and this is definitely absolute top tier for me. I read The Talisman last summer. It was absolutely brilliant. I do think that this book kinda resembles The Shining, because this book is also about a young boy who starts his journey at a hotel during a cold time. He has a wise mentor too. Yeah, The Shining vibes. And I also do really want to reread The Talisman in English. Okay, next we have The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is my recent read, and this is very good. I really enjoyed it. It was a very slow-paced book. I read this book really slowly, but I still enjoyed it. I started the book around January 27th, I think, when I bought the book, and finished in early May. So before I bought this book, I heard that this was a book that had no plot, but just vibes. I absolutely disagree with this. This book does kinda have a plot, because this book is actually about 2 people with magical abilities who participate in this night circus, and they are opponents They're each other's opponents, and one of them has to be the victor, the other has to lose everything. And this book actually revolves around that rivalry, but there are also a lot of characters here, and the book does not have a linear narration. I mean that in one chapter you are in one place in one time period, and in the next chapter you go and you are in another place, in another location. I really disliked what happened towards the end. Not the ending per se, I think that the ending was done well. There was one character I really liked, and if you know, you know. If you read the book, you know what I mean. If you haven't read the book, I will say nothing else. Okay, next we have The Children of Húrin by J.R.R. Tolkien, and this is absolutely top tier. I love this dark, gloomy book. Darkest thing Tolkien has ever written. If you have seen my previous videos, you heard me talk about this book a lot, and I will not repeat what I have said in the previous videos. Feel free to rewatch my previous videos where I talk about Children of Húrin. Let's move on. Okay, next we have The Neverending Story by Michael Ende, and absolute top tier. I will not say anything else about this book because, like with Children of Húrin, I talked a lot about The Neverending Story in my previous videos, and I talked about The Neverending Story even more than about Children of Húrin. I have a Why It's Worth Reading episode dedicated to The Neverending Story, feel free to check it out. I'm sure that when I read the book again, I will have more to say, and maybe there will be another video, but for now, I will not say anything else because I have said enough about this book. Next we have The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, and I need to read this again. I do not remember much. Oh, let's add need to read this again, for I do not remember much. Yeah, it's a very difficult read. You need to read this book multiple times to understand everything, and Tolkien really loved adding some extra names and so on. But yeah, it's a difficult book, but this is definitely the book that I'm going to read again. I really want to read the English version, but I'm scared. It was scary for me to read in Russian. I can't imagine what it's like in English. Okay, then we have The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, and also Lord of the Rings nearby. So let's start with Lord of the Rings, and all of the books, all three of them, are absolute top tier. I absolutely love them, and Return of the King is my favorite book in this series. The first book is a little bit difficult for me to read because of all the descriptions, and it doesn't help that when I read the books in Russian, I had a different translation of the first book than the other two, and the first book's translation was much more difficult. This book 2 and 3 felt easier to read. However, Lord of the Rings is still top tier. I recently bought myself one huge volume in Russian in the same translation as the second and the third books of my old edition. And now I have all three books in one translation. The Russian translations of Lord of the Rings deserve another video, and there are a lot of those videos on YouTube. And I selected the translation which is much easier to perceive. Yeah, the translation of that I own made the books a little bit more Slavic. This doesn't bother me. If I want to appreciate the original, I have the books in the original English language. Okay, then we have the entire Harry Potter books. The main reason I decided to reshoot this video is that I have forgotten to add Harry Potter and the Stormlight archive. Yeah. Okay, the first book is absolute top tier for me, and so is the second. I reread the first three books last year, and I really appreciated The Prisoner of Azkaban, and I really loved how wholesome Ron Weasley is in the third one. He's the most comfortable character there. He's the best here. Then we have The Goblet of Fire, which I am rereading, and it's also a top tier. And then we have Order of the Phoenix, which I would simply add to the awesome tier. Well, because I do think that this is definitely the darkest book in the series and my least favorite. Too much umbrage, I guess. It's too thick and everything. So let it be in the awesome tier. Then we have Half-Blood Prince, which is my second favorite in the series after Chamber of Secrets. So yeah, Chamber of Secrets and Half-Blood Prince are my absolute favorites. And finally we have Deathly Hallows, which is also absolute top tier. And then we have the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, all 4 parts that have been released to the world. We are waiting for the 5th one, The Knights of Wind and Truth. I will reread the books prior to the release of the Russian translation. So the very first two books are absolute top tier. They're absolutely brilliant, magnificent. They're done really well. So the third one, Oathbringer, could have been done better because I thought that it was kind of boring. And the fourth one is simply awesome. Okay, next we have The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, the first book in the Wheel of Time series, and it's really awesome. So when I read The Eye of the World for the first time, I thought it was very slow paced. It was a little bit dull. However, now when I think about it, I appreciate it much more. I think that's because it's kind of similar to Lord of the Rings. Well, the first book does take a lot from Lord of the Rings. However, do not rush to think that this is simply a cheap rip-off Lord of the Rings, because Wheel of Time stands on its own. Solid series. It's just that there are too many books, I think. So here's The Great Hunt, also awesome. And Dragon Reborn. All awesome tier. Okay, what do we have next? Next we have The Gunslinger by Stephen King. And this is good. I'm not a huge fan of the Dark Tower books. So every time I talk about the Dark Tower books, I always point out that prior to reading the books, I was hyped because of expectations. And before you go, your expectations are only yours, blah, blah, blah. You need to take into consideration where these expectations came from the fans, from Stephen King himself, and from the metal bands. And I thought that if these people really loved the books, I would like them too, but that's not what happened. Sure, these are very solid books, but definitely not my favorite. I do really love The Wastelands. I think it's the best book in this series. Wastelands, really awesome. Okay, let's find the remaining The Dark Tower books. Okay, The Drawing of the Three. It could have been better. When I read The Drawing of the Three for the first time, I thought this must have been written on drugs. And it's kind of true, because Stephen King used to be a drug addict. He was taking lots of drugs, and lots of books were written under the influence of drugs. That's not to say that his 80s books were bad because he wrote them under the influence of drugs. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that The Drawing of the Three is the book where drugs were the most obvious here. So then we have Wizard and Glass, which in my opinion is definitely the worst book in this series. So yeah, I know that I only read the first 5 books. I did not finish the series, but that's only because I did not like the editions that I had. If I find the good edition, I would read the books again. However, I do remember that I heavily disliked Wizard and Glass. I really hated that it was one huge flashback, and it was mostly a focus on some vanilla stuff, if you know what I mean. However, I do remember the scene where this character named Eldred Jonas, spoiler alert, vandalizes the room of the boys. And the Wolves of the Calla, the 5th one, this is actually really awesome. I think this is the most dynamic book in the series. This is also where Stephen King's obsession with 19 came, but in his defense, it was the crash that he experienced in real life. This is what affected him. Wolves of the Calla is really cool. Okay, then we have 13 and a Half Lives of Captain Blue Bear by Walter Moyers. I nearly said Michael Ende. Both authors are German, by the way. I need to read this again, for I do not remember much. Actually, no, I do remember quite a lot. However, just like J.R. Tolkien, Walter Moyers really likes names and other details. I do remember saying that this was actually a clever book. I read it in February 2020 and I really enjoyed it. Then we have American Gods by Neil Gaiman, and need to read this again, for I do not remember much. I do not remember the 80% of the book. I do remember the Wisconsin part. Sorry if I mispronounced the state. Wisconsin, sorry. That part is where this book reminded me of Stephen King novels. However, this is much more lighthearted compared to Stephen King books. Okay, here we have Sapphire Blue by Kirsten Gier. No, it's Emerald Green, sorry. And here we have Ruby Red and Sapphire Blue, and all of these need to read them again, for I do not remember them. These were actually really fun books. I really enjoyed them, but I read them in 2015. And yeah, fun times. These books were legit fun. I really enjoyed them. I really hope to own copies of these books. By the way, I used here the German covers. I like them more. And the Russian covers are actually the same as this. Next we have Equal Rights by Terry Pratchett. I need to read this again. Yeah, I know that this is one of my all-time favorite books, however, it has been 4 years since I read them, and I would love to read them again. Next we have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, and this is absolute top tier for me. I absolutely love The Name of the Wind. Yes, there are some parts that I really dislike, some moments, some flaws, but it's still a top tier for me. This is definitely the book I will reread again and again. I really loved it. I talked about the book in my previous videos. Feel free to check them out. I will not repeat myself here. So next we have Berne and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I need to read this again. Just like with Equal Rights, it has been 4 years. And this is actually the very first book that convinced me that I can read in English. At the time, I was more concerned with reading in English. Sure, I understood almost everything that was written there, the alternative version of Berne and Luthien, and also the poem Lay of Luthien. It took me around 3 months to read this book. Now, if I start reading it, I will definitely going to have an easy time reading it. At least much easier than I did in 2020. Next comes The Fall of Gondolin. Since this is Tolkien, I'm going to add This Is Good here. I'm not a huge fan of The Fall of Gondolin. Not my favorite book Tolkien has ever written. Not a bad book per se, it's just not my favorite. Next we have Unfinished Tales by Numenor and Middle-earth, and it's also very good. Read it last autumn, and I do remember Aldarion and Erendis' marriage. Next we have Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, and I need to read this again. I only read the book last spring, and I actually do not remember much. And also, given that I read this book in English, and the book was written in the previous century, it was kind of difficult for me to perceive the book. Seriously, I really thought that after Tolkien nothing would be really hard for me, and that's kind of true. However, to this day, I kind of struggle with really big books, and the books that were written long ago because they feature really old language. Next we have The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I need to read this again. I actually own a copy and I'm unhauling it. I really want to rebuy this book. This one and American Gods, I really want a different edition of them. Next we have The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents by Terry Pratchett, and this is actually a really solid book. I really liked it. Just read the first page of this book. Just read the first page. You're going to love it. Next we have Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, and I am sorry, I apologize to the fans of the book. I really do not want to shock them, but it could have been better. I read this book again last year. To be honest, when I read the book for the first time, I thought it was really dry. I think that's because the authors are English and the book is full of English humor. I actually wanted to read this book again in English to appreciate the English humor. The book wasn't anywhere, at least for the proper price, and I had to read it again in Russian, and now I do not really rush to read the English version. Maybe one day. Okay, then we have Pan's Labyrinth by Cornelia Funke, and this is actually very good. Cornelia Funke did really a solid job adapting the film Pan's Labyrinth to the book. However, I do have my own biases against novelizations. Okay, I'm okay with watching the film adaptations or TV adaptations of a book. However, it does not work the other way around. If I find out that the book is a novelization of an existing film or TV show, that's my pet peeve. I cannot really appreciate it. I decided not to keep the book because I thought that if I really want to go back to Pan's Labyrinth, I would watch the film again. I really do not want to read the book unless it's in English. I would love to read this book again in English, and that's only because Cornelia Funke, a German author, wrote this book in English. As someone who also wrote a book in English, and it's not my first language, I really want to appreciate my fellow foreigners. Next we have Wishes by V.E. Schwab, and it's legit awesome. One of the best books that I read this year. So I'm sure that when I read this book again, this is going to be in the absolute top tier list. However, for now, it's worth the awesome tier. Oh, then we have Here Be Monsters by Alan Snow. Okay, here we have A Game of Thrones and Here Be Monsters. However, let's start with Here Be Monsters because A Game of Thrones is a part of the series, so let's go with the standalone book first. So, Here, The Monsters has a film adaptation, a stop-motion film adaptation. It's made by Laika, the same studio that made Coraline, and the adaptation is called The Box Trolls. I watched the adaptation prior to reading the book, and the book and the film are completely different, and I think that the book was better. However, I really do not remember much of the book. I do remember, however, that it's the type of the story that I really like, that one small thing led to a massive outcome. That's actually also true with A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones. Okay, Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin. This is awesome tier. There used to be a time when A Song of Ice and Fire would have been an absolute top tier, but now it's simply an awesome tier. So where are the rest of the books? So here we have A Clash of Kings, my favorite book in the series, and also The Storm of Swords. But A Feast of Crows, on the other hand, it simply could have been better. I know that a lot of fans, including me, kinda liked A Feast of Crows less than the other books because it did not feature our favorite characters from the previous 3 books. The book featured kinda new characters. Okay, knowing George R. R. Martin's writing style, we can assure that the characters from Feast of Crows are going to play a massive role in the future books. However, we still wanted our old favorites. And they kinda did return in A Dance with Dragons, legit awesome. Oh, I also forgot to mention one thing. Traditionally, when I make a tier list, I tend to add an extra tier midway, and at the end I look at the results and think whether I should change something. Something may be changed at the end. Alright, let's move on. So then we have His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. Where's the first one? Let's start with the first one. Oh, here's Northern Lights. I think that this series is really good. Not my favorite, but still, Northern Lights and The Subtle Night were solid books. Gonna be honest, I consider His Dark Materials to be too technical. When I was reading the books, I felt like the characters were doing things because they were supposed to do things. They felt too technical and they kinda lacked soul for me. Which is ironic because the books feature characters whose souls actually have an animal form, called the Daemons. But I still think that the first 2 books were really good. I liked that one event led logically to another. But the 3rd book, the Amber Spyglass, throw it to the hellfire where it belongs because it sucks. I absolutely hated it. The main reason I hated this book, it tossed everything that could have made it awesome to trash. All the awesomeness was replaced with little kids playing Adam and Eve, if you know what I mean. Okay, if you read the book, you know. I do not want to talk about this book. It's definitely one of the worst books that I have ever read. Let's move on. Okay, next we have The Ichabod by J.K. Rowling, and I need to read it again. I read it in early 2021, and this is actually a really solid book. However, while reading, I thought that it was a thriller disguised as a children's novel. A political thriller, yes. And I thought that it was way too dark, and it scared me at 26 years old. And what's most important, I noticed that in this book, J.K. Rowling repeats some of her old patterns. Well, for example, spoiler, in this book you have this bad boy, let's call him bad boy, confront the hero because the bad guy's father got his ass kicked, sorry for using that language, because of the hero. And this bad guy comes to the hero and he's like, my father got his ass kicked because of you. Okay, next we have The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, and it's an absolute top tier. I absolutely loved it. This is the first book that I read in 2024, and I loved the book before I reached the page 100. Just like The Name of the Wind. By the way, this edition of The Last Unicorn contains the foreword by Patrick Rothfuss, and he's like, are you at the bookstore? Are you looking at the book, wondering whether you should buy it? Yes. Okay, I will not talk about The Last Unicorn no more because I talked a lot about it in my previous videos. Next we have The Wise Man's Fear, the second book in the King Hill Chronicle series, and I actually did not enjoy it as much as I loved The Name of the Wind. Okay, The Name of the Wind, definitely brilliant novel. It was spectacular. It made me order the second book before I reached page 200. I read the series twice, and on my second read I liked the Wise Man's Fear much more. However, the second half of the Wise Man's Fear is way too cringy for me, and there was one scene in the second half that made me think this is when the Kingkiller Chronicle stopped being the Kingkiller Chronicle. That was the scene where the series lost what made it awesome in the first place. But luckily that was just one scene. At the end was kinda happy for a while, and it was again the Kingkiller Chronicle. Okay, next we have Gloriana by Michael Moorcock. Throw it to the hellfire because it's one of the worst books that I have ever read. And it was my first major disappointment because I really liked the annotation. It's about a queen who ascended the throne after the death of her wicked father. The country was at prosperity. However, the foundation of said prosperity is very fragile and it's about to be shattered. Sounds cool, right? No. I hated how instead of actual solid political intrigue I hated that she had to become who she was only through abuse. Throughout the novel, her biggest problem is overcoming her personal trauma. Okay, not a bad thing, overcoming trauma, but I hate that I was promised one thing and I got another. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem, other than deception, was that the book was legit boring. It was really, really boring. It was really, really bad. Okay, next we have House Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This is really good. I read the book only last autumn and I need to read it again. I'm sure that when I read the book again, I'm going to rate it much higher. I do need a solid edition of this book because first I got myself the Georgian edition, which I could not read properly, and the second edition was terrible. A second edition that I bought, the English one. It was terrible, it was cheap, I should not have bought it. Okay, next comes King Arthur and His Knights of the Round Table by Roger Lancelin Green, and this is actually awesome. I really enjoyed it. I read it last summer. This is one of the most underrated books on my shelves, and this is definitely a solid interpretation of King Arthur stories. Okay, next we have The Witcher by Andrzej Sapkowski, but first let's do Neverwhere. Here's Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, and sorry, I have to add it to the meh category. I do not remember much and I got rid of the book. I'm not reading it again. Okay, this book was solid enough for me to appreciate Neil Gaiman and continue reading his books. However, it was not solid enough for me to be like, oh, I really want to read this again. Definitely it has a readable value, it's definitely exciting. No. And I heard that this is also a novelization of an existing I think it was a TV film or something. I do not have a soft spot for novelizations, no. Thank you. Next to The Witcher we have The First Law. I need to read this series again. All three of the books. So I read the first book in 2017 and the second and third in 2021. Where's the... here it is. Okay, I do remember the vast majority of events. I do remember the characters. I do remember Glokta. And while reading the book, I thought that Robert Carlyle was a perfect actor to play him. And to be honest, I'm to this day disappointed that we do not have the First Law TV show. When I read the books, I thought of a high-budget TV show made by HBO. And also, do you remember the TV show Vikings that came on History? The reason I mentioned this is the color spectrum. So we have, in that show, we had the blue, cold-like color spectrum in the scenes on the north, and I thought that the said color spectrum would fit the First Law perfectly, at least in the scenes of the north with the Logan character. I do remember very well that the ending of the third book, the ending of the trilogy, was a total slap in my face. I felt slapped. Do not pay attention to these two Wheel of Time books. I added them by accident. I did not notice that they were already here. So let's move on. Between the Witcher books, we have Soul Music by Terry Pratchett, and sorry, but that's meh for me. It was a so-so book for me. Okay, not a bad book per se, however, it didn't do anything for me. The reason I got myself the book in the first place it was about music, because you know that I really like books with musical themes. I am a music addict, and books with music themes rock. Did not enjoy this one. Okay, same with Guards. Here we have Guards by Terry Pratchett, and I'm sorry, I did not enjoy that one. However, I still have the book, Guards. I'm not getting rid of it so far. I don't know, maybe one day I will come around, but I'm not sure. And then we have the first 5 The Witcher books by Andrzej Sapkowski. So here we have The Last Wish, and it's definitely a good solid story, and also really like Sword of Destiny. I really like that the first 2 Witcher books are simply stories about this big guy with white hair hunting down monsters for money. You do not think much, you simply enjoy the hunt. And then we have Blood of the Elves, which was a start for a more global storyline, and this is actually awesome. This is definitely my favorite book in the series. Sure, just like with The Dark Tower, I only read the first 5 books. In both cases, I enjoyed the 3rd book most of all. And I also really like the fact that the Witcher-themed Blind Guardian song is named The Blood of the Elves, because I do think that this is definitely the best book in the series. The 4th and 5th book, Time of Contempt and Baptism by Fire, I do not remember much. Okay, next we have Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. I only read the first book, and this is actually a really solid good, because I thought it was legit very funny. It's lighthearted, it's sassy, it's adventurous, it's easy to read. It's fun. Okay, I do confess that when I read this book again as an adult, I did think that this book lacked something. However, it was still fun, so I was okay with it. And the last we have The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, and this is absolute top tier for me. I loved it. Okay, in this tier list we have 3 fantasy books / book series that I definitely see as a good adaptation for the screen. First one is The First Law. I see it as a solid HBO-like show. Then we have the Stormlight Archive. I think it would be close to Avatar: The Last Airbender or BBC's Merlin, with lots of youngsters at the front. It would be a good show for youngsters. And The House in the Cerulean Sea would make a great cartoon. The House in the Cerulean Sea, yeah, it has a few moralizing moments, and it's definitely not like any other fantasy that I read. It's definitely a modern thing. I like that the fantasy aspects of the book are very down to earth. They are very everyday like, really exciting. I really want to read it again. Absolute top tier. I love it. And now, following the tradition, I'm going to observe the list and think what I might change. Let's see. Okay, after all, this is still a Song of Ice and Fire book, and I decided to add A Feast of Crows to the This is Good tier. After all, the book is still really solid. What else would I love to change? Nah, everything is alright. Alright, that's all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. So what do you think of the books in this video? How would you rank them? Let me know down in the comments. See you next time. Goodbye.